Imagine you are standing in a city of 5,000 people, sealed inside steel, moving through open ocean, and no one outside knows exactly where you are. There is no Amazon delivery. There is no hospital you can drive to. There is no grocery store, no municipal water authority, no power grid drawing from a regional network. The nearest Walmart is approximately 800 miles away, give or take the turn of the sea. Now imagine that this city has not touched land in 63 days, that it carries enough fuel to circle the Earth roughly twice without refilling, that it produces its own fresh water from the ocean surrounding it, that it processes its own sewage, generates its own electricity, performs its own surgeries, bakes its own bread, and must do all of this continuously, without pause, without failure. Because the moment any single critical system degrades, 5,000 human beings begin moving toward a survival problem that no external agency can solve in time. This is the operational reality of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, not a weapon platform, not a symbol of national power. A fully engineered, closed-loop civilization deliberately designed to function as though the modern world does not exist. And the question that sits at the center of everything, the one that every admiral, every naval architect, every logistics officer has spent careers trying to answer, is this: how do you feed, hydrate, sustain, and maintain the cognitive function of 5,000 people who are completely cut off, when the algorithm that governs their survival must never, under any condition, be allowed to fail? Start with what you can see, because what you cannot see is where the engineering lives. The flight deck is the most visible surface. The arresting wires, the catapults, the choreography of aircraft and crew that produces images striking enough to become posters. But below the waterline, in the sealed compartments that almost no documentary has ever properly mapped, something far more complex is running. There are approximately 2,500 compartments on a Nimitz-class or Gerald R. Ford-class carrier. Not rooms, compartments, specifically engineered spaces with specific pressure tolerances, specific fire suppression characteristics, specific ventilation constraints. Each one is a node in a system, and the system is not designed for efficiency in the civilian sense. It is designed for redundancy, because redundancy is the only engineering philosophy that survives contact with isolation. If you lived inside this structure, if you worked a 12-hour shift in one of its lower machinery spaces, you would understand almost immediately that the geometry of the ship is not accidental. The corridors are narrow by design. The hatches are low by design. The compartmentalization is aggressive by design. Because in a sealed environment 700 feet from any help, the most dangerous failure is not the one you planned for, it is the cascade. One system tips into the next, and if the architecture does not contain the failure, if the boundaries between systems are not physically enforced by steel and pressure doors and redundant valves, then 5,000 people discover very quickly what it means to have no fallback. The logistics of feeding a floating population of this size begins not at the galley, but at the mathematics. A carrier feeding cycle is not a meal plan. It is a resource flow problem with a hard constraint on one end and an absolute non-negotiable on the other. The hard constraint is storage. The absolute non-negotiable is caloric output. 5,000 people performing physically demanding labor across rotating 12-hour shifts require an average intake calibrated not to preference, but to operational readiness. A sailor who is calorically deficient for 72 hours begins making the kinds of micro-errors that in a civilian context produce inconvenience, and in this context, produce catastrophe. The galley operation on a carrier runs 24 hours across multiple serving lines. On a Nimitz class, the daily food production approaches 18,000 individual meals. 18,000 in a single 24-hour period. The logistics algorithm governing this output begins with what is called the stores load, the pre-deployment provisioning event, where every ounce of food that will sustain the crew for a 60 to 90-day deployment is calculated, purchased, packaged, and loaded with the precision of a system that has no tolerance for error in either direction. Underload means the crew goes hungry toward the end of deployment. Overload means critical storage space, which is also cargo space, which is also mission capability space, is consumed by surplus provisions that the system did not need. The calculation is not guesswork. It is an algorithm that accounts for caloric demand by rating and duty station, for spoilage curves on every category of perishable, for the thermal stratification inside the refrigeration compartments, for the water content embedded in fresh versus frozen stores, for the predictable surge in consumption that occurs during high-tempo flight operations when the flight deck crew burns calories at rates that dwarf the administrative staff 2 decks below. Every single food item loaded onto a carrier before deployment has a projected consumption rate, a projected spoilage date, and a projected replacement schedule tied to a potential underway replenishment, and the planner who gets this wrong does not answer to a disappointed customer. They answer to an operational failure. But here is what most people never consider when they think about feeding 5,000 people on open water. The food itself is only one part of the logistics equation. The other part, the part that makes the food system possible and that would collapse it entirely if it failed, is water. Fresh water on a carrier is not imported. It is manufactured. The evaporator systems on a nuclear carrier use heat from the reactor plant to flash seawater through a distillation process that produces potable water from the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Arabian Sea, whatever body of water the ship happens to be crossing. A carrier produces hundreds of thousands of gallons of fresh water per day. Not stores, not preloaded supply. Produced continuously from the ocean it moves through. This is not a convenience feature. This is the foundational system upon which everything else depends, because water is embedded in every other system simultaneously. The crew drinks it, cooks with it, uses it in the medical spaces, uses it in the laundry, uses it in the firefighting systems, uses it in the steam catapults that launch aircraft from the flight deck. Remove water production, and you do not just thirst, you lose the ability to conduct flight operations within hours, because the catapult steam system requires a water source that only the evaporators provide. If you were living on this ship, if you turned on a tap in your berthing compartment, the water that came out traveled from the ocean, through the evaporator, through a distribution network of pipes running through compartments you will never see, and arrived at your sink having been manufactured, tested, and cleared for consumption within the last several hours. The system runs continuously because it must. There is no reservoir. There is no municipal backup. The ocean surrounding you is simultaneously your only source and completely unusable without the machinery that converts it. This is where civilian logic collapses entirely. In the civilian world, a water system failure is a crisis that prompts emergency calls to infrastructure authorities who dispatch repair crews who arrive with equipment from an external supply chain. On a carrier in the middle of the Pacific, a catastrophic evaporator failure during a deployment with no underway replenishment, scheduled for 14 days, means the water reserve, measured in hours, begins counting down the moment production stops. The engineering department does not call a contractor. The engineering department, comprised of sailors who have trained for exactly this contingency, begins isolation procedures to contain the failure, initiates emergency repair protocols, and simultaneously begins rationing what remains. The crew does not learn about it through a press release. They feel it in their water consumption limits within 6 hours. This is the architecture of constraint-based engineering. Every sailor aboard is a component in the system. Every behavior, every water usage habit, every degree of thermal management in the galley, every maintenance interval on every valve in the distribution network is calibrated to keep the system running, because the system is the only thing that stands between 5,000 people and the open ocean. And the people who designed this system did not assume that human beings under pressure are rational. They assumed the opposite. They designed every failure mode with the understanding that stress degrades judgment, that fatigue compounds error, and that the only reliable countermeasure is a physical architecture that contains the consequences of human failure before they can cascade. The food-water system keeps bodies alive. But a carrier does not simply need alive bodies, it needs bodies that are sleeping, thinking, maintaining, repairing, and performing precision tasks across a schedule that does not acknowledge night or day in the conventional sense. Sleep architecture on a carrier is one of the most psychologically complex elements of the floating population problem. There is no natural light cycle below the main deck. There is artificial lighting tuned to shift cycles, there are 3 rotating watch sections, and there are berthing compartments where a sailor might be sleeping 6 inches below another sailor who just finished a 12-hour shift, and another sailor who is 4 hours from starting one. The bunks are stacked 3 high. The aisles between them are narrow enough that 2 people cannot pass without turning sideways. In this environment, the psychological management of 5,000 human beings is not a soft skill consideration. It is a mission-critical system requirement. Studies on military operational effectiveness have consistently demonstrated that cognitive degradation from sleep deprivation produces the same error profile as moderate intoxication. An exhausted sailor on a flight deck is not a minor liability. They are a potential catastrophic failure point in a system where one decision error can cost aircraft, crew, and irreplaceable operational capability. The carrier addresses this not through aspiration but through structure. Routine is the technology. The watch schedule is not tradition. It is the algorithm that distributes cognitive load across time and across human capital in a way that minimizes the probability of simultaneous failure across multiple critical positions. Even this is a logistics calculation. Even sleep is a managed resource, and this is where the pressure intensifies. Because the systems described so far, food, water, sleep architecture, are the baseline. They are what the carrier must maintain simply to exist as a habitable environment. But a carrier is not designed to merely exist. It is designed to operate, be continuously, at high tempo, in conditions ranging from calm to severe, for months at a time. The medical system embedded within the ship must be capable of performing emergency surgery, managing trauma, treating infectious disease outbreaks, and maintaining pharmaceutical inventory across a deployment cycle without resupply. The medical spaces on a carrier are not a sick bay in the vintage sense of a cot and an aspirin. They are a functioning hospital with operating rooms, dental facilities, and a pharmacy that must anticipate the statistical probability of illness and injury across a population of 5,000 using actuarial models, not unlike those used by insurance underwriters, except that here, a miscalculation does not result in a financial loss. It results in a sailor whose condition deteriorates beyond the treatment capacity of the ship's resources. The pharmaceutical inventory is not restocked on demand. It is loaded before deployment based on projected need, and when it runs short, the solution is not a phone call to a distributor. It is a request through the chain of command for emergency resupply at the next viable opportunity, which may be days away. Every medication on board, every surgical supply, every unit of blood, they are all part of the logistics algorithm. They are all calculated, they are all constrained, and they are all part of the system that defines whether 5,000 people can survive not just the ocean, but each other and themselves across a deployment that offers no exit and no alternative. Yes, the waste systems deserve a moment of deliberate attention because they are the system that logistics discussions almost always skip, and they are the system that, if it failed, would make the food and water problem academic. A carrier generates thousands of pounds of solid waste per day. It generates millions of gallons of gray water from sinks, laundries, and cooking operations. It generates hazardous waste from maintenance operations, from aviation fuel handling, from battery systems, from 100 categories of chemical product that a 5,000-person operational city necessarily produces. None of this can simply be thrown into the ocean. International maritime law prohibits it for most categories. Naval operational security prohibits it for others, because a debris trail in open water is a navigational signature that can be tracked. The ship must process, compact, store, or neutralize its own waste stream on board, using systems that occupy significant volume and require their own maintenance cycles and their own power allocation. If the waste processing system degrades significantly, the the ship does not become uncomfortable. It becomes toxic. The accumulation of unprocessed biological and chemical waste in a sealed, pressurized, air-recirculated environment introduces disease vectors and air quality failures that can incapacitate personnel faster than any external threat. The maintenance sailor who checks the waste processing system on the overnight watch is not performing a secondary duty. They are maintaining one of the foundational conditions that makes human habitation of this platform possible. The power system underlies all of it. A nuclear carrier's reactor plants produce enough electricity to power a medium-sized American city. This is not a metaphor deployed for scale. It is a factual statement about thermal output and electrical generation capacity. Every galley, every evaporator, every ventilation fan, every computer terminal in the Combat Information Center, every light in every berthing compartment, every pump in every fluid system, every catapult charge cycle, all of it draws from the same source. The reactor does not turn off. It cannot turn off, not in the way a civilian power plant can be shut down for maintenance and replaced by grid power during the outage. It is the grid. It is the only grid. The engineering plant that manages reactor operations runs on a watch rotation that is arguably the most demanding cognitive schedule on the entire ship because the people managing it are not monitoring a system that fails slowly. They are monitoring a system where an unmanaged excursion, a coolant anomaly, a pressure event that is not correctly identified and correctly responded to within a compressed time window produces consequences that cannot be contained by anything else on the ship. The training required to stand watch in the reactor spaces takes years and is not approximated. It is exactly acquired or it is not acceptable. The sailors who hold those qualifications are a resource as finite and as critical as the water in the evaporator tanks, and the system that sustains their readiness, their sleep, their nutrition, their cognitive load management connects back in a closed loop to every other system described above. Feed them correctly, hydrate them correctly, manage their rest correctly, because they are the people on whose judgment every other system depends. What this floating population represents, seen from the outside, is a weapons platform. What it represents from the inside is something the architects of naval engineering have been refining for decades, a proof of concept for human civilization without external dependencies. The carrier does not need the internet to function, though it uses it when available. It does not need a banking system, though its personnel use one ashore. It does not need a municipal authority, a power utility, a water board, a hospital network, a waste management service, a supply chain, or an emergency response system. It has internalized every single one of those functions into a single, integrated, self-sustaining architecture that moves continuously through hostile waters, sustained by an algorithm of logistics so precisely engineered that the failure of any one node propagates a response cascade designed to contain, compensate, and correct. Before the human population, it supports even fully registers that something has changed. The food gets made, the water gets produced, the waste gets processed, the power keeps running, the medical team stays ready, and somewhere in the lower decks, in a space that receives almost no attention in any public account of carrier operations, there is a system managing a function so critical that its designers have built 5 independent redundant backups into the architecture. And that system, and what it protects, and exactly what would happen if all 5 backups failed simultaneously, is a question that the engineering record answers in documents that remain, for now, beyond the reach of this conversation.